Good evening, everyone. I'd like to invite everyone to make themselves comfortable for a very special evening of conversation and dialogue between Rabbi Shmuley Boteach and the Polish Consul General Maciej Golubiewski. How did I do? Poland, as we know, lost 3 million Jews during World War II. But what you probably don't realize, no, during World War II.
Any comments?
Yeah, we'll wait till later.
After, we're going to give people the opportunity to comment.
But what you don't realize is that Poland lost an additional 3 million people. So out of a population of, let's say, 30 million, 6 million were lost. That's almost 20%, 10%, 20?
25.
It's a huge percent. Half of that was over, what would be 10, 12% of the non-Jewish population were lost. So if you think about the United States and think about some massive war that cost the lives of, I don't know, 30, 40, 50 million Americans, it's a national tragedy. So one way I'd like to frame this is that many people in Poland feel that they have been the victims, but yet the spotlight has not only been put on the Jewish victims of the Holocaust, but have made them into the villains. And I don't know if that would sum up why there is this sensitivity that the Polish government is kind of channeling. We are mostly focused on the years from the rise of Hitler through World War II and just right after. There was a 1,000-year period. The reason why there were 3 million Jews in Poland is very largely in part is, by and large, they liked it there. There were hiccups, there were some pogroms, it wasn't perfect, but they found a home in a place where they didn't feel the same way in any other country. That's why there were that many Jews there. So without really talking about the shared history that the Jews have within Poland, we're missing out. We're focused narrowly on a thin slice of history, and we can't give any hakarat hatov. We can't give any, that's a Hebrew word, for being gracious to our hosts, which we should be for that 1,000 years. And I'd like to create that as a framework for this conversation, this dialogue that will happen now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Naftali Citrin, the rabbi of the Carlebach Shul, one of the most famous shuls, certainly in New York, in the entire United States. And Naftali is my rabbi. He's taller than me.
That's not hard.
Better looking than me.
That's fake humility.
I've always been into fake humility. Thank you very much. Okay, but tonight is a serious night, and I want to jump straight into it. I think Naftali framed this discussion accurately, but from a particular perspective. Because there are many Jews who are grateful to Poland for the Jewish sojourn in Poland for 800 years, and who understand that it was one of the longest residences of the Jewish people in world history. The Jews were in Poland longer, almost for an uninterrupted period, almost longer than Israel. We had the 400 years of the first temple, and a few hundred years before that, that was probably longer altogether, but then it was broken up with the destruction of the first temple by the Babylonians. We're about to go into a period commemorating that. Then we had another 400 years in the second temple. Then we were exiled by the Romans, almost completely, especially by Hadrian, after the Bar Kokhba revolt of 132 AD. So Poland represents a vast, vast expanse of Jewish history. And Naftali is saying that we have to show gratitude. I should say, because I want this to be a very honest evening, and I'm very grateful to the Consul General, to Maciej, who's here with his wife, Agata, and I think it's courageous for you to be here because there's a lot of heated conversations that are going on that are not generating light, they're generating heat. So I'm grateful for you being here. But the gratitude is not shared by all Jews. There's a lot of anger that's shared by many Jews. I have people telling me all the time. I've been in Poland 4 times this year. I have people telling me all the time, and I'm about to publish a 500-page book on the Holocaust. I took my children to the killing fields of Europe for weeks and weeks last summer. We called it Holocaust Holiday, one family's descent into genocide memory hell. And people said to me, what an inappropriate title, Holocaust Holiday. That's the whole point. How do you make a summer trip visiting Auschwitz, Birkenau, Majdanek, Sobibor, Treblinka, let alone lesser killing fields that are not as well known but are equally horrible? Bialystok, where they burned all the Jews alive in the shul, or Tikchin, where they massacred 2,000 Jews in a mass grave, and their houses were taken almost immediately. Until today, it has the vestiges of a real Polish shtetl. I have people saying to me, I'm never going back to Poland. Polish people who refuse to even speak the language. Let me also make the point that while Irish Americans call themselves Irish Americans, and while, I don't know, my wife is an Australian American, the truth is that I don't know anyone calling themselves Australian Americans, about 1/3 of all American Jews are of Polish descent, including myself on my mother's side. I'm Ashkefardi. On my father's side, my father was born in Iran. And even Iranian Jews call themselves Iranian Americans, even though the government of Iran threatens the Jews with annihilation like every 15 minutes. It's actually a law in Iran that you must threaten to murder all the Jews and if you go like past 20 minutes, they can incarcerate you, etc. And even so, they call themselves Iranian Americans. There's large numbers of Israelis love visiting Berlin and going to German cities. And the Germans slaughtered all of you, and there's no question that it was the Nazi German Holocaust. They killed us. Even if there was Polish participation, it was orchestrated by the Germans, it was incited by the Germans, it was carried out by the Germans. The Germans murdered 6 million Jews. There may have been Ukrainian collaborationists, there may have been Polish collaborators, but the Germans did it. And yet Jews go to Germany, and 250,000 ex-Soviet Jews kind of moved to Germany, but when it comes to Poland, the numbers are small. Is that fair? And this dialogue is well past due. And Jonathan's telling me the story of how they marched all the Jews and killed them all, and suddenly an older Polish man walks over and he leans on the car, and he says to Jonathan in Polish, like, why are you here? And Jonathan says, my rabbi friend from Oxford is here, I'm teaching him about what happened in Tarnov. And the man starts to cry and he says, I want to tell you a story. He said, I was 13, 14. If I remember the story accurately, this is a quarter of a century ago. He says, I had a Jewish girlfriend. She was like 13. And the Nazis made her dig her own grave. And then they shot her. And as he told the story, he completely broke down. And I was, wow, that was a guy who eyewitnessed to a murder like that. And he cried, and then he just walked away. And Jonathan said to me, does that fit your stereotype of the Poles? And of course it didn't. So here's an evening of illumination. I hope we will illuminate. I'm sorry for this lengthy introduction. I will say that Maciej is an extremely fine man. I've very much enjoyed getting to know you and your wife. You're from Łódź.
Yes.
And I took my family to Łódź. It's a terrible place for Jewish memory, unfortunately. 275,000 Jews were in the ghetto. It was overseen by a guy who we debate till today, Mordechai Chaim Rumkowski, who in September of 1942 gave the most infamous Jewish speech of the Holocaust, the famous Give Me Your Children speech. I searched for the exact spot where he gave that speech based on photographs. And you can all watch this documentary that we did. But you're from Łódź, and I'm very grateful that you're here.
But I'm very happy to be here with my wife and people from my consulate and some representatives from Polish American community. Before I react in more general terms to your introduction that you framed so nicely, and I think in many ways you said you went ahead of a lot of things that could have been said by other Jews. I think you actually made some statements that others would not have made, especially about the actual responsibility of the Germans and not mythical Nazis. And this was one of the reasons why this whole debacle about the law started. I mean, why the reason for the law was that for many, many decades, we've seen a push of responsibility away from the Germans as the perpetrators to us, to Poles and others, and we're kind of defenseless. After 45, we're a communist nation. We're basically not sovereign. We could not define our narrative. We could not speak our soul, our heart. And only since 1989, after communism fell, we could really start shaping the narrative. But we didn't really quite do that so much because we had other things on our minds. We had the whole economic restructuring. We wanted to join the EU. We wanted to join NATO. And political and historical policy and kind of history and memory were not on the kind of political agenda at the time. So we kind of left it by the wayside, and we woke up in the 90s, in 2000s, where suddenly the mythical Nazis were the perpetrators, and the Poles were almost equaled, and the Polish nation, the Polish state that did not exist, as you rightly said, during the Second World War, was equaled with the Axis powers, and we saw this barrage of newspaper accounts that were basically defamatory. That's why we like to call the law anti-defamation law rather than the Holocaust law, as a lot of you prefer to call it. There was, until the 50s, an organization called the Polish American Jewish Federation. And that was a very successful organization. I think it operated out of New Jersey. They had a lot of, every year they had a big gala. They invited a lot of, there were very prominent citizens of New York and the tri-state area, and actually I think it was a national body. And there was no problem until communists took over in 1945, until those incidents that you described in Kielce and others happened, until people realized that communists, in fact, were not very keen on helping resolve the Polish-Jewish question. And we know it from 1968, where communists actually went ahead with all sorts of provocations and anti-Semitic provocations, kicked out a lot of remaining Jews out of Poland. So that Polish-American identification of Jews disappeared. I think they kind of lost faith, and I'm not surprised why. Many Poles lost faith that Poland would come back as sovereign nation. So maybe that is why there's been this crisis of identity. Another one is obviously memory. I think today, Prime Minister, and we will discuss the revisions to the law. Today, the Prime Minister, when he was speaking in the lower chamber of the Polish Parliament, he said something very, very striking. He said that, why is it, for most of you have some Polish roots. There is a reason why most of the survivors from the Holocaust are Polish Jews, not other Jews. Because if you lived in the 40s in Poland, if you came across a Pole, you'd have a chance to survive. That he may or she may help you or may not, but you did have a chance to survive. If you bumped into a German, you were guaranteed to be shot and killed. That's why the statistical artifact is such that most Jews that survived the Holocaust happen to have Polish roots and also happen to remember anti-Semitism that happened before the war. And that is a fact, but it's an artifact. It's something that we need to remember when we discuss the Polish-Jewish relations. How am I to decide whether a Jew or a Christian is better in terms of how they live their lives? And I think that's what separated Poland from a lot of countries of the time, where there were the Jews were kicked out, in Portugal and Spain, other countries. What happened when you look at interwar Poland? You also see this phenomenon of a lot of Jews joining the independence movement. They were actually joining the legions. Joseph Piłsudski, the marshal who liberated Poland from the so-called partitions, they were joining the legions. A lot of them emigrated from Russia, because remember, most of the pogroms, when you talk about pogroms, you really talk about Russian pogroms. I mean, the name pogrom is not a Polish name. It comes from the Pale of Settlement era, where Russians were retaliating after a supposed assassination of one of the czars, and Poland does not have a history of pogroms. It's the lands that were taken over by the Tsarist Russia that actually experienced this type of history. So I know that all those memories going back centuries can be all kind of mangled up, but when you look at when Poland was actually ruling the territory, by most part, Jews really did not suffer much oppression. Over the period of 3 or 4 years during the 40s, the Polish organization called Żegota, who was the organization, the Council for the Aid of Jews, that was established by the Polish government in exile in London and the underground state in Poland, spent in today's money, in today's dollars, over $20 million in direct support to Jews who were persecuted in Poland by the Germans. $20 million, in some estimates, including other donations that went through that channel through London, it's $70 million. That organization helped close to 50,000, according by some members of this organization, 50,000 Jews. This is unprecedented. No other organization in the history of Europe during that time helped to such an extent, and unofficially, and not only on such an extent, but in the presence, in the lack of any sort of state, really officially state recognized, in the presence of a non-existent state, so to speak. So it was in such adverse circumstances. The aid to the Jews, in fact, was so large that Germans had to actually use an unprecedented law, unprecedented means to do something about it. That's why in the 40s there was a law instituted. Anybody who helped the Jew, extended a helping hand, or gave somebody a piece of nutrition would be killed. And not only he or she, but his or her family. There was a year after was another law that if you knew of somebody, if you were aware, if you possessed information that this type of aid was delivered to any Jew, you were also killed. This was absolutely unprecedented in Europe. When Anne Frank was being helped, aided by the Dutch, those who helped her, one of them went to a labor camp, one of them was arrested for 6 weeks, and another one was let free or paid a fine. Those people and their families would have been killed mercilessly by the Germans if this type of aid was delivered to Anne Frank, if she happened to be Polish.
So you're explaining the genesis of the Holocaust law, the Anti-Defamation law, that the Poles felt that they were being defamed, that rather than the Germans being blamed for the Holocaust, it was being the responsibility was being shared almost equally with the Poles. So the Polish government felt the need to take extreme action and criminalize that kind of conversation. And today, exactly today, the law was kept on the books, but it was decriminalized, and it's now a.
Yes.
So I understand that. So I want to make this very conversational now.
Mm-hmm.
So there's two competing narratives.
Right.
And I feel that's being dominated by extremists on both sides. The two competing narratives are narrative one: the Jews lived in Poland for 800 years. It was like the United States. It was near paradise. There were pogroms. There were anti-Semites. There were Jews that were murdered, but they were a small minority. The Jews, by and large, flourished in Poland with specific liberties. The other narrative is that the Jews lived there with nowhere else to go, so they're very grateful that Poland took them. They wouldn't have chosen to be there because their lives were not great. They were always second-class citizens, dominated by a very Catholic country that often painted them as Christ killers, that there were many pogroms, there was a lot of anti-Semitism, and when the Jews were given the opportunity to start emigrating to the United States with different waves, I think my grandfather came here in beginning of the 20th century, that they left in large numbers. Those are competing narratives. It goes without saying that Elisha Wiesel is the inheritor of his father's global legacy as the world's most famous Holocaust survivor. And you can see what Elie Wiesel meant to us as a family and our organization by this full-page ad that was taken out. I should say that Elie Wiesel died 2 years ago. Elisha just commemorated the second yahrzeit of his father. And Elisha is one of the most worthy inheritors of a great legacy that I've come across in my life. He's a man of unique morality, and he's really delved into this issue with me, and I'm very grateful that you came tonight. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So Elisha, you and I have heard these two narratives. We've talked about it. We've debated it. It seems to me, Maciej, that the truth lies somewhere in the middle, and I feel that the conversation is being dominated by extremists. It is true that Jedwabne, for example, nearly all the historians agree that in that atrocity of July 10th, 1941, that it was mostly Poles who murdered approximately 300 Jews, most of the Jews who lived in Jedwabne, which is 20 minutes from Lomża, where my grandfather is from. The Germans almost certainly incited them to do it, but they found willing Poles who were prepared to kill the Jews.
Sure.
Kielce, there are no Germans to speak of. It's all Poles. The 4th of July, 1946. I was there at midnight doing Facebook Lives from Kielce just a few months ago. That's entirely Polish. However, it is unfair to tar and feather the entire Polish nation and say that they were all engaged in these kinds of atrocities, which is definitely not true. The Polish Home Army did help supply and arm the Jews who fought in the Warsaw Ghetto, albeit not enough, but then again, they may not have had enough, or maybe they felt that the battle of Mordechai Nalevich was a futile battle. It is absolutely true that the Poles never collaborated with the Germans the way the French did, creating a collaborationist government. The French helped put 70,000 Jews on trains to Auschwitz. And I think it's fair to say that Poland gets more opprobrium than France when it comes to the Holocaust. And maybe that's how you feel, that's why the Polish government feels this way. Like, what the heck's going on? The Vichy regime is an official collaborationist government under Nazi authority and control, and we're the ones who get blamed for the Holocaust. I understand that. But to say that it was just like the United States, I don't want to speak for Elisha. I'm going to give him the first question when we go to questions. But Elisha always makes the point to me, and he has a unique authority in our community. Elisha always makes the point to me, Shmuley, if it was this paradise, why did no Jews choose to stay there after the war? They did choose to go back to Amsterdam, even though...
Well, that's obvious. I can answer here.
Just to finish this point. They did choose to go back to Amsterdam, even though 90% of Jews in Holland were murdered. For those who say, oh, the Poles, 90% of Jews were killed because the Poles all collaborated, 90% were also killed in Holland, 90%. And Anne Frank was almost certainly turned in by a Dutch citizen. That's what most historians today believe. But the Jews went back there in fairly large number. And in Germany, as I said. But after Kielce, they kind of decided not to stay. And you have a tiny Jewish community today.
One of the reasons why this thing happened today, which is we eliminated 2 articles from that law, anti-defamation law, is that, first of all, the penalty provisions have kind of detracted from the real purpose of the law, the anti-defamation and honor and dignity of the Polish nation. But I think it also detracted from the main thesis. This law was never against anybody saying that Poles or groups of Poles killed Jews during the Second World War. Never. It was, and it clearly said in those eliminated provisions, that it was the purpose was to criminalize, to penalize those who said that the Polish nation and the state, understood in its collectivity as a nation state, right, operating as a community of values, as a community under law, was complicit in crimes perpetrated by the German Nazi, by Hitler's regime, as understood by Article 6 of International Criminal Court, International Military Tribunal, after the war. This was it, and I think it was completely misunderstood. I'm sorry to say, but even in the article that I was very grateful for on the Katyn monument, you actually also mentioned that this law criminalizes those who say that Poles in some way or the other killed Jews. It's not about that at all. It's about the official collaboration of the state and the nation operating under law as a community of collective community of Poles who treated those people like in the Jedwabne, well, the Jedwabne was after the Second World War, but treated people like Szmalcowniks and others as criminals. Polish state had laws against those who betrayed Jews. Over 200, I don't remember the statistics, I'm not a historian, but there were tens, if not hundreds, of executions of those Poles who betrayed Jews during the war by the Polish Home Army, by the Polish government. These were criminals. How can you accuse a nation for being complicit in Nazi crimes if that nation and its government treated those people as criminals and actually executed and delivered death penalties to them?
So the answer is you're never blaming the nation.
Yes, as a collectivity. Nation, right. You see, nation in European parlance understanding has a maybe a different concept than the United States. It's not the people or some sort of collectivity or group. It's actually nationhood is a community of values constituted within the realm of, or certain realm of law and tradition. Right? There was never in the Polish tradition a concept of exterminating other minorities. We just don't have it in our DNA. The criminals and what happened during the war, where basically most of those criminals were encouraged by the Nazis by all sorts of incentives to do what they did, and those criminals came from all citizens of different groups of Poles, Polish citizens, were those Szmalcowniks, as we call them. They were paid, they were incentivized to do what they did, and in no way represented the nation, the state as a whole. So this was the purpose of the law. And I think it was completely misunderstood in a lot of discourses and discussions in America and Israel.
So the purpose was to criminalize any accusation that the Polish nation collaborated with the Germans.
That was a text.
And it's undeniable that millions of Poles were murdered by the Nazis. But what we in the Jewish community, if I may be so bold, feel disturbed by is Poland taking it to an extreme and saying it was only a very, very, very small number of Poles who participated in any atrocities, when historical accuracy would seem to say that the numbers were larger, even though they were not the state, the numbers were larger. And secondly, why criminalize it at all? Let the truth come out.
That is why the president of Poland, when the law came out, when he directed the law, when he sent the law to the Constitutional Tribunal for evaluation, said, look, I can understand that certain formulations may be confusing. Maybe there is a confusion about what the term nation means. Maybe there is some sort of a lack of clarity. Maybe the paragraph is too long or what have you. That's why he sent the bill to the Constitutional Tribunal. He also directed send the bill to the Constitutional Tribunal because of those criminal provisions. He said, look, and that was corroborated by the Prosecutor General of Poland, who actually said, look, those criminal provisions may not be constitutional. The parliament basically took a sovereign decision. They did not wait for the tribunal and said, look, we're not going to get into the nitty-gritty of the language. We're not taking a step back because the law stands. There will be civil prosecution if you offend the nation or the state. It's not as specific. Those paragraphs are out. I mean, there's no discussion of complicity in the atrocity of the Third Reich, but there is a possibility for the Institute for National Remembrance or other NGOs to sue if somebody defames, the Poland or the nation or the Polish state. But that provision, being so generic, is actually present in most legislations of other countries. I mean, right now, at the moment, we are at the very new beginning. We really are at the beginning. We can put this thing behind us. What Prime Minister Morawiecki and Prime Minister Netanyahu did, they exhibited amazing amount of leadership. They have worked on this for a long time to come up with this agreement. They collaborated on the text of the law. They basically came to an agreement that, look, we need to remove this whole provision and not work on all the details of it. And the product of it was the joint declaration. Let's work through declarations, what we believe in as two communities, Israel and Poland, about our common history. The Catholic Church has never been overrun by an alien body. Poland has. I mean, Catholic Church has always been sovereign, and that's why it's lasted for 2,000 years, and the gates of hell never took over. It's because it's never been overrun. Poland, unfortunately, has. So talking about what happened after 1945 in Poland, I think it's still important to mention the context. I think it's still important to say that, okay, there were communist Poles, there were Poles who collaborated with the Soviet Union and the Soviet Communist Party, is an important explanatory factor that I think can explain a lot. I think in 1942, when General Sikorski was in New York City and he attended the conference of the Polish-American Jewish Federation, there was a joint statement, and I tweeted it once by those Jews in that federation, to that conference, that we are all committed with General Sikorski to a Poland free of anti-Semitism and any sort of discrimination. We're looking forward to a government after the Second World War that will actually be non-discriminatory, and it was upheld. Now, if Poland had really won the Second World War and became sovereign, if General Sikorski could safely come back to Poland, well, he died in the crash, but if actually those people like General Anders and everybody who fought in the were actually rulers of Poland after 1945, I assure you that today we would have Jews in Poland at much larger scale, probably like in Germany, and that it would be that there wouldn't have been Kielce, and there wouldn't have been Jedwabne and things of that sort. So this is really, I mean, Jedwabne was during the Second War, I'm sorry, but Kielce and other anti-Semitic 68, for example, wouldn't have happened. So I don't like to, it's easy sometimes to play counterfactuals, but it really is important to see what happened to Poland after 45, where the country was completely demoralized. Only 2% of Poles after 45 actually had higher education. That was a country in ruins, morally, ethically, when it comes to human capital and vice versa. Somebody did a comparison how many American professors would have to be killed to show how much human capital in Poland was diminished. A third of all top university professorships, I don't know, a quarter of doctors, and so on and so forth. It was a demoralized society taken over by thugs. So I think it's important. But I wanted to talk about this context because, look, Poland is, first of all, super proud, and I will use this colloquial term, that it's been the guardian of memory. for what happened in Poland. We are the country that, for the longest period of time, compared to any other European country, have been actually taking care of those sites. And we've been actually, we could have chosen not to do so. We could have said, look, the UN and you do this for us. But we actually, us Poles, even though we were not collaborators, chose freely to actually preserve those sites of the Holocaust. And in fact, we are the country with the largest amounts of museums and commemorative spaces and symbols in Europe with regards to the Holocaust.
Interesting to me in this era how, with the last surviving generation who were in the Holocaust, losing that generation, there's an instinct, I think, to use the Holocaust and potentially trivialize it. We hear it from all corners. We hear even Prime Minister Netanyahu saying Iran could cause a Holocaust. We hear real immigration issues occurring in this country that are concerning and need addressed, but you hear people saying, oh, it's like the Holocaust. You hear statements made, and this was one of the more unfortunate ones made by your own Prime Minister, that there were Jewish perpetrators of the Holocaust. I think the real question for us as we get more distant with time, and Poland has such a sacred responsibility in keeping memory alive, I guess the thing that I'm interested in hearing from you, maybe away from the public, away from all of the press, things like the law, maybe if you could shed a little insight, how do you talk to your children about this? How do you talk about this within your family, away from the spotlight, but maybe on a more private basis?
I'll be honest with you. When I talk about it with my closest ones, I'm filled with sadness. And I think that feeling is shared by a lot of my colleagues at work, people involved in politics, people who are involved in people that I work with. This whole debacle came to all of the ones of goodwill in this government as a shock, as a shock that we somehow managed to misheard each other so much over the years, that we somehow managed to not understand each other's sensitivities possibly so much over the years, that those traumas and sufferings and memories and everything else created this cocktail of anger and misunderstanding and this disturbance, and that was disturbing, emotionally disturbing, because I think it's this problem came out of the probably feeling of a relative deprivation of recognition of one's suffering, right? I think Prime Minister Morawiecki once said at the very beginning of this whole problem that the State of Israel and the Jewish community had and many more opportunities, and because of that communist factor, to define its narrative, to speak in a sovereign manner about its tragedies, about its history. We were denied that. We were denied it for over 45 years after the fall of after 45, and it's only recently that we've kind of coming to grips also with our own suffering and our own traumas, and I think that's what I said is we both, the Jews and Poles, I think there are many more. There are Armenians and others who suffered so much, and Russians and tons of other nations, but here we are, Poles and Jews. We've just lived through some very horrible things. And that's when I talk to my closest ones, I'm like, look, it's so unfortunate because we're so close. And I don't want to, go into trivialities and kind of be sentimental about all this. But there is this amazing feeling of closeness. When I read telegraphs of the ambassador of Poland at the time, Cichanowski, in 1944, who was writing to my predecessor, Sylwian Strakacz, about what's happening to the Jews who were being transported from Hungary to Auschwitz. And of course, Karski, but when I read those, Karski is known, to all of you, but there are many others. There are ones from Bern.
Karski's not sufficiently known.
Yeah, not sufficiently known, but there were consuls in Bern, in Switzerland, who gave out thousands of visas. There were a lot of unknown people whose graves, until recently, were not even marked, like that consul in Bern who was helping thousands of Jews to get passports to go to Latin America on fake identities. But what I wanted to get at is that lost my train of thought, but when I read those
When you read
accounts,
these-
when I read those accounts, I see there was so much emotion. Those accounts, and I'll share them with you once because they're telegraphs. You know,
Yeah, I would love to see
Yeah,
them.
they're secret kind of missives. Look, do something. You know, talk to Agudat Jews in New York City, to talk to their representatives here. Nobody's doing anything. Poland was the first country, there was the first country, and people who were in the Polish government, underground government, were screaming out loud to the whole world about the tragedy of the Jewish people, who are also Polish people. Nobody was listening. Nobody was listening, in this country too. When Jan Karski came to talk to President Roosevelt, President Roosevelt turned a deaf ear. When he talked to Justice Frankfurter, he said, look, sir, I think you're a very well-meaning individual, obviously a good officer, but I don't believe anything you're saying. And there was, so for me, I'm personally moved when I read those accounts.
In my opinion, the United States has not done a proper reckoning of its own response to the Holocaust, not to fighting Hitler, where the United States was exemplary, and 450,000 American soldiers died fighting Hitler in Japan, Imperial Japan. But in terms of what are major publications almost bearing the story, like the New York Times, there has not been a proper reckoning done, and there should be.
The book that I gave Shmuley is called The Crime and the Silence by Anna Bicant, and it's a haunting book, not only because it talks about the unbelievable terror that was inflicted upon the Jews of Jedwabne by their Polish neighbors, but also because it talks about really the decades-long resistance to tackling that history that occurred by more modern-day Poles. And through a number of interviews and conversations and over lengthy periods of time, the author really gets into the mentality of a people who don't want to not only look at what happened 40, 50 years ago in the eye, but realize that some of the people still living in their town were actually there on a day where the numbers range from 300 to 1,500 Jews were packed into a barn and set on fire, and died alive. And the fact that some of the perpetrators were believed to still be alive in that town, by the author as she interviews people, it's a haunting book to go through that process that that this particular town in Poland was going through.
You know what? I would like to comment on this. Poland, in fact, has probably experienced the largest. Poland is the amount of publications on the Holocaust, on what the Poles did to the Jews, and the whole gamut, the whole spectrum. It's probably one of the few countries that is releasing and publishing at such rate. Even as we speak, we're talking about 6, 7, 8 groundbreaking books. Like there's a very recent publication by the Center for Jewish Holocaust Studies in Poland called Dalej is Not. The Night Continues. It's their studies of those small pogroms in the parts of eastern Poland. That was actually financed in part by the Ministry of Culture of that government that we're talking about. When you're saying that there's a lack of sort of introspection or auto-reflection, I beg to differ. I mean, the government, the very government that's being accused of that, is actually financing and sponsoring some of this research. There's Joshua Zuckerman's book recently. There's tons. And Anna Bicant's book was early, but there are other books on Jedwabne. There are official studies by Institute for National Remembrance on Jedwabne. There's a lot. But as I said, history was not properly taught, and it was not properly lived through after 45. I believe that because of lack of legitimacy of the communist state and because of falsified history that Poles had to learn at school, people had to kind of live with those very undefined. They didn't know what to attach themselves to. If there was proper pedagogy, if there was proper education, if there was real freedom of the press and freedom of education and freedom of expression, we probably would have discussed Jedwabne in 1950, right? Not in 1990. But as I said, that period between 1945 and 1989 and later, because as I said, politicians were preoccupied with other things in history, created this kind of lack of consciousness, historical consciousness.
I am probably, I don't know, but I'm probably the only person here. I am probably the only person here who survived the actual generation of Holocaust survivors. I survived, and I remember Poland as a child. And there were so many issues that I go back in time that I remember, the fear of Poles, many things. But then today, knowing much more, I realized that many problems were due to the lack of any kind of neighborly or friendship relations between Polish Jews and Polish Poles. One of the many problems were, and you as a rabbi may understand that, is that Polish Jews, the religious Jews in Poland, were very much afraid of assimilation. And because of that, they kept their children and themselves away from having much to do with Polish Poles. I can only...
And who are you blaming for that? Whose fault was that?
I'm not blaming anyone. I'm just blaming how it was. The actual truth.
The Poles stuck to themselves, the Jews stuck to themselves.
That's right. They did not know Polish history, and Poles did not know Jewish history. And we were growing up in the country and growing and flourishing in spite of it. In spite of all these rather poor relationships. Look, I was 9 years old when the war broke out. I have my whole family in Auschwitz. I have a lot of pain as I'm listening here. Like you mentioned, children are torn away from parents. What is happening today with those children is terrible. It's terrible. But how can you even compare, how can you even have those thoughts when you remember children being torn away from their parents to be killed? Know that they will never see their parents, that the parents will never see their children. There's so much going on, this, such a distortion of history. And people who write history, and they think they're great historians, but unless, like you, Father, once said, unless if you were in the fire, and if you are next to the fire, there's only a tremendous difference for historian to talk about the Holocaust. So I took that liberty of saying.
We're obviously very sorry for the murder of your entire family, and there's no words. But because as Alicia also said, because the Holocaust is kind of being diminished through these constant comparisons, that's why I think the Jewish community has to have a strong relationship with the Polish government, the Polish people, because they are entrusted with this memory almost more than anyone else.
Yes.
You have to go to Poland and understand. You know, Treblinka was completely plowed over. They closed Treblinka, I think, in 43, 900,000 Jews murdered, when Operation Reinhardt largely came to an end. And then they built a farmhouse there to show it was a farm. If you go today, it's a proper memorial. They're doing more there, and that's because of the Polish government. And it's quite remarkable, and we are very grateful.
The rabbi asked what happened after July 4th, 1946, after the Kielce pogrom, and why did Jews not stay? Yes, that happened. Yes, 46 or so Poles did it. Nobody ever talks about what happened to those Polish people who committed the crimes. They were arrested. Some of them were tried, and some of them were executed.
9 were put to death.
Right.
But many were not.
Right.
Okay.
But more importantly, what happened after then? After then, the Iron Curtain was coming down in Poland, and Jews were in a communist country. You talked about Warsaw being flattened. There was no house to go back to. And what was also importantly happening was the brecha, and I use the word propaganda in the sense of telling things to people. Come to Palestine, Zion, this is your land. They were trying to, and I'm not saying it was bad, get Jews to leave Poland and to go to Palestine, not to come to the United States. My mother and her family were part of that, but they wound up coming to the States. And that's an important thing to remember, why they left after 46, 7, 8, and 9. They were being dragged to come to Palestine.
Alicia, do you accept that as an explanation? Because it's a point that you've made to me many times. You have felt that the greatest test, I guess it's like the Kennedy test of the Berlin Wall, where Khrushchev and Kennedy are debating like which system is right, communism or capitalism, and Kennedy gets up in the famous Ich bin ein Berliner speech, which means I am a jelly donut. Someone should have laughed at that. Anyway, he should have said Ich bin Berliner, correct? Anyway, right. So and he famously said that we can debate all we want which system is better, but we never had to build a wall to keep our people in. And that was like the Kennedy test. If you leave, it means that you don't like the place. So do you accept that? So you were asking always, if the Jews really did find comfort in Poland, they would have stayed after the war, but they didn't. They didn't find comfort. And that was do you accept that as an explanation because they were being dragged to Israel?
There's always context. There was pressure to emigrate to Palestine in many parts of Eastern Europe. So I don't know that there was something unique about Poland in particular. I think you look around where people went back to their homes, and in Poland they did.
What they found, that was nothing.
They found that they were not welcome.
That's right, definitely. At that time.
And it wasn't easy to get out. It wasn't easy for my mother, my grandparents to leave Poland. They had to be smuggled out at night through the mountains, Surrey-Tipsha Street. It was not easy to just get a train and go to Vienna.
I'm an American-born, third generation, almost fourth generation American, and my late husband was born in Nedvědice, which is near Minsk and is now Belarus. When his father was jailed in 1943, he was jailed because he was a rich man and not because he was a Jew. That part was not discussed. In 1943, when the Polish army was reformed, he was made a colonel, got to go to Siberia and visit the children once, and they remained in Poland until 1951. Why they left Poland was because of Stalin and not because of the Polish people. In fact, I have pictures of my husband with a pony and his little dancing shoes, but they left because of Stalin. And they did go to Israel because my mother-in-law was at that point tired of the moving from place to place. My question is how to reconcile this experience of complete negativity with Jan Karski, who was a hero, who came to America with knowledge, which was completely refuted by Frankfurter, by Roosevelt. There was a fear in the American Jewish community, and I heard these stories growing up from my mother, who was an NYU student in the late 30s. There was such a fear that they might become us, that the lack of action on Roosevelt's part was accepted. I consider that Roosevelt was not such a great hero to the Jewish people, that there was no reason that those bombs couldn't fall 5 miles west of where they did, and I don't care about what strategic statements are made. I've read more than most, and Shmuley knows that I am a little more involved than many people and I have a deeper knowledge, but there is no way of reconciling what didn't happen in America without recognizing, or there's no way of reconciling without recognizing what didn't happen in American strategy. You know, my father was with Patton's army. He didn't even know what was going on.
And let's remember that the United States Visa Department was controlled by an out-and-out anti-Semite by the name of Breckinridge Long, who worked to keep Jews out of the United States until he was finally replaced in the Roosevelt administration. Do you want to comment on that at all?
Excuse me?
Do you want to comment at all, Maciej?
Well, how do you reconcile this, you said, negativity with those heroic individuals? Negativity, I didn't quite catch I mean, I think history, especially tragic history, always produces heroes of sorts. But, you know, Jan Karski was just one of tens or even hundreds of silent heroes. I mean, people who parachuted themselves. We call them cichociemni, you know, the quiet darks. I don't know how to translate it into English. That were even women, you know, that parachuted themselves into occupied Poland and tried to help the underground government through various means. Look, a lot of people, to help a Jew in Poland, it took over 10 plus people to help somebody of Jewish. It wasn't just one person who hit somebody. It was a network. I mean, nobody really knows how many of those people were there, but there were a lot of silent heroes.
My family is from Poland. My great-grandmother was from Rzeszów. My other great-grandmother was from Radimo. I have Polish roots. My question is, why isn't there a path to citizenship for Jews who want to move to Poland? You say yourself that Poland is the inheritor of Jewish history. I go to Krakow. I can't eat in any of the Jewish restaurants because there's no kosher. There's one, but there's no. They're called Jewish restaurants, and a Jew can't eat there.
I think there's
I go to Auschwitz.
Why can't he eat there?
Rabbi Boteach, wait, I'm gonna get to my point.
It's not kosher.
No,
But that's not the government's fault.
No, like it's this cultural ethos where Poland is the inheritor of our culture, our Tishbishe Kedusha, and not the Jews. So anyone who had a family before 1918 who left Poland cannot become a Polish citizen. This is not just for Jews. This is
Everyone who left again?
a Jew who left Poland before 1918, his descendants cannot claim Polish citizenship.
No.
My Yiddish teacher left Poland in 1967 or 68. She was expelled. Her brother got Polish citizenship, and she cannot. Anyone who had a relative descendant who served in the military, a foreign military, cannot become a Polish citizen. So my question is, why can't Portugal, Spain, even Lithuania has eased the requirements for Litvaks to become Lithuanian citizens? Why hasn't Poland?
That's very interesting. I'll check that. I mean, the need for birth certificate, something that says that your grandparents was Polish, is kind of a formal requirement. But that is not just for the, that situation you just described would not happen just for the Jews. I mean, Poles who were, living in Poland before 1918 and were citizens of Prussia, Russia, or Austria-Hungary would probably encounter very similar problems. So I think this problem is not just affecting the Jews, it's affecting a lot of people who would love to reclaim their Polish citizenship, but somehow they don't have the papers.
The sentiment you're expressing is shared by some, especially around the time of the Krakow Jewish Festival, that the Poles are co-opting Jewish culture as if it belonged to them and not to the murdered Jews who preceded them. I do not subscribe to that ethos. I think it's wonderful that there's a resurgence of interest in Jewish language, Jewish culture. I'm someone who believes we should teach the Torah to non-Jews without them having to convert to Judaism. We're not a proselytizing faith. I loved the Krakow Jewish Festival last year, but I heard all the criticism. I just simply don't agree with it. There are many restaurants in Kazimierz, in Krakow, that are indeed Jewish and not kosher. I wish they were, because I starve when I go there. There are some good kosher restaurants. Chabad has a great fast food place at the Isaac Synagogue. But there should be more. But you can't blame the Polish government on that.
But may I add to this?
But I love the fact that the Polish people want to rediscover
exactly.
the Jewish heritage. And it's something I applaud. I love the Krakow Jewish Festival.
That's very interesting, actually, your comment, because it actually confirms what is sometimes bandied about in the press, that it's become cool, using a colloquial term, to become, to be interested or to do Jewish things in Poland. It's become kind of, fashionable. And then what is interesting, the Polish Jewish community that's growing in Poland is actually growing from the inside. So there are people, they're not immigrants, Jewish immigrants that come to Poland and join the Polish Jewish community, but these are people who just rediscover their Jewish roots.
Hi, I'm a first-generation American. My father was born and went through 5 years of concentration camps. So I'm just going to address what you said, because you're the representative of Poland. And you said that you called Celts an incident, okay? These are people who survived 6 years somehow and came back and were murdered. And if it was your family and it was your town, that's not an incident, okay? And I also don't think that it was a demoralized country full of thugs. These were good Polish neighbors. These were neighbors of my parents, just like good Germans killed Jews. And I think we're being too nice here. I think you're whitewashing. Really, you're not representing what really happened there. It's like Bulgaria and Denmark really did protect the Jews and take them out. But the Polish government didn't step in and stop You have a question?
Sorry. Just, okay, important question, so I'm gonna.
Yeah, sure. I apologize for using the term. You know that there were Poles who tried to help the Jews who are being killed at the
Of course I
time?
know that.
Let
We
him
all
speak,
know
please.
that. We
So,
all know
Please,
that.
you ask your question. It's a very important question.
Let me tell you,
Let him respond.
there's a lot of research on this. There's a lot of research. It's free research
But
on
we
what
all-
happened
I
in
know
Kielce.
that.
You have to let him
We all
speak,
know.
please.
What
So-
happened in Kielce happened in every town. My father went back to Jolishitz, and it happened in every town that they had to get out of there because they were all being killed. I would like you to get me the value of my family's home there, because I need that. Okay, that's our property.
A lot of people lost their property in the war. Jews, ethnic
And more
Poles, and
so,
others.
I lost my grandparents and I lost my aunts and uncles, and I just, of course, you seem like a lovely person, but I think, you know, like a lot of us, you were born either in the 60s or 70s or maybe the 80s even, and you're a different generation, and I feel it's being very whitewashed, and that's my response.
Let me try. Well, look, you're absolutely entitled to your statements. Now, anything when it comes to discussion of those historical issues is present. Dalej is not. The book that I just mentioned is actually a micro study of those villages where those pogroms and those situations where Poles, under various circumstances, were killing Jews are being studied. So there's absolutely.
Well, you're not allowing him.
Well, like,
but
look,
you're not.
the-
Wait, just one
what I'm
moment.
saying is-
You asked a very important question, but you have to give him.
Well,
Well, your question, I guess, is, are you whitewashing history? So he has to be allowed to respond.
Look,
Please.
I just mentioned 10 minutes ago that Poland is flooded in an unprecedented manner with original historical research covering the whole spectrum of interpretations. There is nothing that either the government, well, or me, I'm sorry if I made that impression, that would like to whitewash anything. So, the facts speak for themselves. There's efforts, official efforts, to preserve those memories and to do honest historical research on them.
And that we appreciate it.
And to go to the opposite extreme and say the Poles are acknowledging the large number of Poles who did collaborate, albeit unofficially, not as a nation, but as individuals, I don't think they've done enough of that either, to be perfectly honest. That's not a criticism of my guest tonight. He's the Consul General of New York, and I understand that he's a proud Pole, and he's proud of his country, and he wants to do his best to create a warmer relationship between the Jewish and Polish communities, which is admirable. I believe, however, that friendships are always based on truth, and I think that the Jewish community has to be introspective, and I think the Polish people have to be introspective, and the 900-pound gorilla might indeed be restitution, because it's a very big issue. I don't know the solution to that. I know it's coming up more and more, and someone asked it. But your final statement that you lost your grandfather, you said?
Grandparents, aunts, uncles.
Well, I'm sorry for all of your family who were murdered. But let's be clear about one thing. And this is the one thing that the Poles have a right to say, is that the Nazi Germans perpetrated the Holocaust, not the Polish people. That I agree with. And that I understand, that when we start pointing a finger and say, they were killed and Poland did it, the Nazi Germans murdered 6 million Jews. They were Poles who collaborated. But without Hitler and without Germany and without the invasion of Poland, there would not have been a Holocaust, because the Jews lived in Poland for 800 years, and there were pogroms, and there were anti-Semitic, not incidents, but pogroms that murdered a lot of Jews. But there was no Holocaust, there were no gas chambers, there was no Treblinka, there was no Auschwitz, there was a city called Auschwitz, which didn't have gas chambers. That's, I think, a fair statement. But there can be no whitewash, and I agree with you. But I don't want this dialogue to be dominated by extremes. Having said that, I understand the depth of your emotion given your loss.
Absolutely, I also understand that. And of course, of course, absolutely. I will look. It
was never a Holocaust, though. That's the point.
No, every year.
We can't diminish the crime of the Holocaust. The Consul General and the Prime Minister, God willing, tomorrow to announce, while the iron is hot, that Poland will, God willing, be moving their embassy to Jerusalem.
Above my pay grade, but I can SMS him real quick.
And I thank you, Consul General, for your erudition, your eloquence, and your illumination this evening. God bless you. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi Shmuley. From my side, I would like to thank you for this invitation. I hope this will be the beginning of a more deeper and conversation about other issues, especially those positive ones.
Thank you for such a beautiful gift. And Hebrew, amazing. Thank you very much. Thank you, Consul General. Thank you much.